I am Hashim Al-Barra. It is one of Asia's longest armed conflicts, and now the Sri Lankan government is convinced the end is near. On Sunday, President Mahinda Rajapakse announced the military was on the verge of wiping out the Tamil Tiger rebels, also known as the LTTE. The rebels have been fighting for a separate state for Tamils in Sri Lanka. They started out as a military group, but slowly they began controlling parts of the island. At the height of their power, about a third of the country was under the LTTE. Earlier this year, the Sri Lankan government launched an offensive against the rebels and claimed to have crushed many of their strongholds. A narrow strip of land on the northeast coast of the country was declared a safe zone for civilians to escape the fighting. And this is exactly where the last of the rebels are supposedly hiding. Any attempts to capture the tigers could threaten the safety of the civilians in that strip. The UN estimates up to 150,000 people are trapped there, but the government insists the number is less than half, about 30 to 40,000. The government has rejected international calls for truce, which they argue would allow the rebels a breathing space to regroup and continue the bitter war. In London, hundreds of protesters blocked a major bridge near the Parliament, demanding Sri Lanka halt its military assault in Tamil areas in the north of the country. The protesters gathered to draw attention to the situation of the civilians who are caught in the middle of the fighting. UK Foreign Secretary David Miliband said there should be a humanitarian ceasefire to allow civilians to leave the danger zone. And joining us, our guest in Toronto, Rajan Philips, a Tamil political analyst and former secretary of the Movement for Interracial Justice and Equality in Sri Lanka. In Washington, DC, Patrick Mendis, he is vice president at the OSGOOD Centre for International Studies and author of the book Trade for Peace. And in London, Charu Lata Hogg, former journalist and associate fellow in the Asia program at Chatham House. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start by asking Mr. Rajan Philips. Mr. Rajan, this isn't the first time that the government has been saying that it has trounced the LTTE. How much of this is truth and how much of it is myth?
Thank you. I would like to think that the conflict has no future or it is over, but I'm afraid it is unfortunately not the case. It is not just the military conflict that we have to focus on. What underlies the military conflict is a long-standing political problem, which once was characterized, and I think it is still true, is the basic incongruence between the state of Sri Lanka and the plurality of its population. So until that problem is solved, the conflict will continue, maybe not in a military form, but in some other form. So if the government says that the conflict is over, that creates the illusion that what we have to deal with now is a post-LTTE hypothesis. I think that's the wrong assessment of the situation.
All right.
It is the ending of the conflict and the Tamil political problem that we have to focus on.
Let me include Mr. Patrick Mendis. Mr. Patrick Mendis, as you've heard, Mr. Rajan is saying that the reality is much more complex than saying this is just the beginning of the end. We should look after that. Do you agree with what he's saying?
In essence, I think he has a right analysis. This is more than a military conflict, and it has both political and also economic struggle that need to be addressed. I think until those issues are resolved, I think one form or another, this kind of expressions of violence would continue.
Okay, let me talk to Charu. Charu, both Rajan and Patrick seem to accept the fact that the LTTE has been dealt a huge blow. Do you think that this is seriously going to impair their ability for the future?
Well, it definitely means the end of the LTTE as a territorial force. It is beyond doubt that the LTTE will not command territory in the manner they did before.
But again, is it going to be the beginning of the end of the LTTE as an idea?
Well, the LTT as a terrorist force cannot be stamped out. You know, this has been manifested many times in the past few months. You know, consequent to military victories in the north and east, there have been suicide bombings all over Sri Lanka. So the fact that this is the end of the LTT does not mean that this is the end of LTT terrorism or of forces who support a response in that manner.
Mr. Rajan, again, you have the LTT saying that they might accept an internationally brokered peace process, but they are saying that they will never accept any peace deal which would entail surrendering their arms. Isn't this a sign that the LTT feels stronger than before?
I think the strength, if at all, if there is any strength to be attributed to the LTT, it is a reflection of the negative position, politically negative position, that the Sri Lankan government is unfortunately taking in spite of its military successes. So far to date, we have not heard anything from the government spokesman about what it intends to do on the morrow of its long-heralded victory in political terms. So to the extent the government insists on a position of Sri Lankan sovereignty, unitary constitution, and LTT terrorism, it is more than likely that the LTT and its supporters, wherever they are, will continue to insist on traditional Tamil homeland, Tamil self-determination, and Sri Lankan government's genocide. I am using explosive terms, but this is what the two sides are bandying. And until there, thank you.
Okay. There is a humanitarian aspect to this story, which is the more than 150,000 people trapped in the no-fire zone. Mr. Patrick Mendis, why isn't the government willing to cease fire to provide for a humanitarian corridor?
I think in the past experience with the LTT was a negative factor. I think contributed to this situation with the government because in the past they rearmed and retrained and recaptured the areas they lost during that ceasefire period. Given that experience, I think a government is not in a position to repeat it any longer. So I think this is one factor that convinced the government not to have a ceasefire, because it was not very successful. And I think there is another factor that I think we need to consider is mainly the humanitarian aspect. Because of the cost of the innocent civilian, government need to intervene or get the international NGO to support and provide the medical emergencies for the civilian. It has to come to some kind of reconciliation through the government acceptance of international NGOs support.
Okay, Charu, aren't you concerned that because of the international support that the government of Rajapakse has, it doesn't seem to be very sensitive to the humanitarian aspect, and it continues pounding the areas where thousands are trapped?
Well, since the beginning of this phase of the conflict, since 2006, and more recently, Sri Lanka is undergoing a humanitarian catastrophe. You know, as you mentioned before, 150,000 people or a few less are trapped in this increasingly shrinking conflict zone with no access to medical facilities, and are being bombarded by both sides. The LTTE has used the civilians as human shields. The Sri Lankan government has shelled on these areas which they themselves have declared as safe zones. These include hospitals, playgrounds, you know, areas. So there is no area within the conflict zone where the civilians are safe to go. You know, the UN has reported starvation deaths in this area. You know, even when the civilians flee these conflict areas, they are kept in heavily militarized camps, and which are more or less detention centers where there's no freedom of movement, no access by international agencies. And given the large-scale history of disappearances in Sri Lanka and other large-scale human rights violations, I think, you know, this raises a question mark on the government's intent.
There's also another issue, which is, Mr. Rajan Philips, we're talking about an issue where the government is imposing an embargo and no independent source is there to verify or corroborate facts. Aren't you concerned that truths might be lost forever or concealed, at least by the government, or who knows, by the rebels?
It certainly appears to be the case. But that's the whole point, as has already been mentioned. You know, there has been the experience previously that during ceasefires or peace negotiations, the allegations have been that the LTTE rearmed itself and regrouped itself. And but at the present time, I think by all assessments and the observations by all assessments, the government is at a much superior position militarily and territorially, and it stands to no reason why it cannot involve some international agencies and even governments to bring about a situation of cessation of hostilities, at least to give some relief to the hundreds of thousands of people. It's a shame for people to argue about the numbers, but there are many enough for all of us to worry about, to give them some relief. And that, the reluctance on the part of the government to do that is, again, to go back to my earlier point, is, in my view, unfortunately, an indication of the reluctance on the part of the government to do anything positively in the political direction.
All right, ladies and gentlemen.